So let's go ahead and get started. So again, everyone, welcome to the Defend and Deliver DMARC Email Authentication for Better Email Security Online Bootcamp. My name is Shazad Mirza, and I am the Director of Operations. I am going to be the instructor for these few weeks, and will be available to you, during the sessions. But if you have any questions that you think of after the sessions, please feel free to email either the addresses that are listed there. So you can email me directly at smears@globalcyberalliance.org, or you can email gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org. That will go to me as well as other folks within the organization. So I already said a quick reminder, but just again to quickly review what the bootcamp plan and overview is. So, and I keep reiterating this because we get this question constantly. You need to attend a live session for the certificate. So one session per week, at least full live session. So we're looking at least 1 hour for each session, right? So this week we're going to do BEC and DMARC in a nutshell. So we're going to talk about a complete overview of DMARC and everything that you're going to deal with throughout these upcoming weeks. Weeks 2 and 3, so on May 12th, we're going to go into a deep dive of what SPF and DKIM are. So I'm going to give a quick overview of it today, but go into a deep dive into it next week. Then the third week, we're going to take the DMARC and policies and break it down and go. So it's going to get technical in weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to break it down. Now, in week 3, May 18th, May 19th, and May 20th, you see there's 3 sessions in that week. You do not need to attend each of those sessions. Only attend the session that applies the most to your organization. So if your organization uses Windows for DNS, attend the May 18th, and you can skip the 19th and 20th, right? So if you have a bind server or Linux DNS, you only need to attend on May 19th. You do not need to attend the 18th and 20th, because what will happen is then during that week, the first half of the session will be the same exact thing. It's the second half that's going to be different, because I'm going to do a demonstration in these various types of DNS. So only attend the session that you need to attend. You don't need to attend all 3 in order to get the certificate, just 1 for that week. Then week 4, we're going into detail about reporting and analysis, right? So now you have the DMARC policy in place, you've created it. Now you get all this information. What do you do with it? What do you go through and do this? So that's going to be week 4. And then the last week, in week 5 on June 2nd, we'll do a complete review of the boot camp. So very quickly for about maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then the latter half is going to be about some additional protocols you need to consider using to better secure your email, because you don't want to use just DMARC. There are other ones that are available to you, and I'm going to give you a high-level overview of each one of those. So there's a quick question here. What happens if our organization is thinking about moving the cloud? Would it be beneficial to see both or just the current system? It doesn't hurt if you want to look at both. So, I mean, you can attend all 3 sessions if you want to. That's totally up to you. If you have the time to do so, then you're more than welcome to do so. But if you don't have the time, again, we're going to be recording it as well, so you could always watch the recording later on. So let's go ahead. Let's get into our topic. So phishing, that's what we want to talk about first before we actually go into what everything is and what DMARC is. So as you know, I mean, when you have a phishing attack going on within your environment, what's going on is they're sending you an email. They're trying to trick you into something to think that it's a legitimate option or a legitimate item for you to click on or to read or to reply back to. But in reality, in the back end, you're actually getting something malicious or something that you don't like, right? So like in this case, this baby's thinking they're getting pizza, but in reality, they're getting baby food, which they absolutely do not like and they are not happy about. So that's what phishing is going to do, right? And the problem with phishing is that it's not just receiving an email, it's just what happens when you interact with that email. Is that email asking you to send information? Is it asking you to click on a link or download something that you shouldn't be downloading, right? Because when those kinds of actions are being taken and those actions happen, then you can lead to having some sort of malware infection, right? You click on that link or you click on or download that attachment. Next thing you know, you're infected with some sort of keylogger, right? So, keylogger being something that tracks all your keystrokes and your mouse clicks. or you can be infected with ransomware, right? Majority of the ransomware cases that you may have read on the news started out with somebody clicking on an email or clicking on a link or downloading the attachment in the email. But it's not always going to be necessarily malware that's going to be put on that machine, right? Because they do want, that's one way of using ransomware is one way of getting money, right? But then they could also just say, you know what? We just want them to do some sort of fraudulent activity by saying, here, you haven't paid this invoice, please transfer or wire transfer money over to this account, right? Oh, I'm sorry, we used the wrong account and provided you with the wrong account information. We didn't get the payment. We're having issues with our bank. They changed our bank account number. Can you please wire money here? Right, so they're gonna do fraudulent activity. They're just looking to get the money. They don't want to take down your machine or anything like that. They just want some sort of financial gain from this. Oops. And then it could also be just theft of PII, personal identifiable information, right? Maybe they just want your tax ID. They want your business tax ID. They want your bank account numbers. They want your credit card information. They just want your username and passwords for certain things. Because then with that, they can either sell that data and sell that information, or they can do further attacks, right? If they get your username and password, now they're going to try to see what they can get access to. And it might just start simply with, can you give us your Netflix password? Can you give us your, your password was reset. If that wasn't the case, please click on this link to fix your password reset. And it could be for Netflix or Facebook or some other social media account, because then they'll use that. Whatever you use to your username and password you use there, they'll attempt to use that for other things as well. So be careful with those kinds of things. And phishing is still so successful because it's difficult to determine and see if those messages are legitimate. Because all of these messages you're getting actually look like they're coming from your bank, right? They actually look like they're coming from Facebook or a delivery service, because they're copying those and making sure like this is what their message looks like. So we need to make sure that our fraudulent and phishing message looks the same. So that way people will think that it's actually coming from where it's supposed to be coming from. But then, right, we always tell people, look at the email address as well. You know, is it coming from a Yahoo account? What's the chances of UPS sending an email from Yahoo? What's the chances of your CEO, right, or your manager or your boss sending an email from their Gmail account or Hotmail account? Most likely not going to happen. And if they do, then best thing to do is call them and say, hey, you sent this from a personal email. Is this legitimate? Is this actually your personal email address? And then why did you do that? But then in most cases, when you look at the email as well, the from sender address is going to be spoofed. It can actually look like the legitimate domain, right? It can actually look like what, that actual company's name that's there, whether it be lookalike or at the actual full name. So it could say globalcyberalliance.org. It could say ups.com. It could say, so-and-so.com using their actual domain name. So those are things that we have to watch out for and things to take into account when it comes to phishing and spoofing of phishing emails. Because one of the things when it comes to phishing, it leads to things like business email compromise. So phishing is only just one component of business email compromise. There are other components of business email compromise, like actual email compromise, right? They actually get your username and password and they're actually using your email, right? In that case, it's, there's other mechanisms that you need to use. There's things like CEO fraud, there's invoice fraud, there's legal things and things like that. But what we found is the FBI found was in 2021, based on their internet crime report, that BEC or an email compromise again ranked at the top, right? $1.9 billion were lost by victims of BEC and EAC. And in fact, this beat out the previous year. We're in 2021. So FBI 2019 internet crime report actually had said the BEC and email AEC was at 1.8 billion. So it increased from 2019 to 2020, right? And then if we combine the phishing alongside with it, right? The phishing is also phishing, smishing, and farming. If we combine those and you add up all the numbers, you'll still see that email is one of the top vectors for loss when it comes to financial loss. It's about 40%, which is a good chunk. So why is email still the major vector that's going on? Why aren't people going in and protecting their email? And yes, EAC equals email account compromise. So BEC can also be known as email account compromise. And it impacts everybody, right? There's not, when it comes to these kinds of things, it's not just a large organization they're going to go after. It's not just a Fortune 500 company that they're going to go after. They're going to go after whomever has money, whoever is going to be easy to attack. In most cases, they go after what we in the security world we call as the low-hanging fruit, right? Those being the small businesses, religious institutions, not-for-profits, and so on, because they still have money, right? So as long as they know these groups have money, they're going to do what they can. Because as an example on the left-hand side, right, you see cities as the top three there, anywhere from 800,000 to 1.73 million, but a religious institution as well, right? And religious institutions they get money either funded or they're donated it money. So they took 1.75 million from a religious institution. So they don't care who you are. As long as there's some level of money, they're going to take that information, and they're going to take either information or they're going to steal financial information from you, or actually take the money itself. So BEC and EAC can be used to send phishing is one of the aspects of BEC and EAC. So typically when you go out and look at it, there's 5 different things that fall under the BEC category, but we're not going to go that deep dive into it because we have a lot of things to cover. And this is where I mean, so it doesn't matter where you are either, right? BEC is everywhere. And what you're seeing here in this map are the global locations of the BEC threat actors. So this is something that was provided by Agari. It's in their Cyber Intelligence Division report. I highly recommend you read this report. It is actually very good. It gives you a lot of information about BEC, their locations, and even breaks it down in terms of what are the top locations. Right, and interestingly enough, it actually ends up being Nigeria. You wouldn't think that that it would have reduced, but it ends up actually being in that area. Right. So, but bad actors are everywhere, right? So doesn't matter where you are, they're going to come from different locations. They're either systems are compromised, they're phishing and using your actual domain name. There's different types of attack vectors that are going to be taken into account. But in our situation, we're going to be focusing on phishing, and we're going to focus on spoofing and focus on protecting your domain and what to do to protect and prevent your actual domain from being used. So it's important to know the different types of spoofing when it comes to phishing, right? What's in the spoofing, we're talking about what's in the actual from address, right? The from address that you're seeing. So the display name spoofing, right? This is where you're going to see maybe the CEO's name, right? You see your CFO's name, the chief financial officer's name. You see the bank's name. You see somebody, and their name is appearing there. But in reality, what you actually see, if you actually either hover on the name, or majority of email clients now will actually show you the email address. You're going to see their Yahoo address. You're going to see their Hotmail address, right? You're going to see their Gmail address. So what they're spoofing at this point is they're spoofing, they're using the name, right? They'll put the name there, but behind the scenes, they're spoofing your email address. They're not spoofing, sorry, they're spoofing the name in this case, not the email address. They're just using something else that's not relevant to the actual person. It's just something that they created and made up in hopes to get you to act and urgently send information or transfer information or wire some money or anything like that. So be careful with something like that. That's why a lot of clients, email clients, are now showing you the email address. Before they had it hidden behind it, but now they're showing it to you. If they're not showing it to you, then make sure you hover on top of the name just to make sure it's actually coming from the correct location. Then there's lookalike domain spoofing. So this is where they're making it look like it's coming from that particular company, but it's not actually that company, because what they did was they changed a few things around, right? Instead of an O, they used a 0. Instead of an M, they used an R and an N, because if you use the R and N closely and you look at it really quickly, it looks like an M. So they'll do these different kind of combinations to make it look like it's coming from that particular domain, but it's not. Right? This happened with Google. Like with Google, they put it in capital letters, but instead of O's, they put zeros. So that's why they used all caps, because that way it looks, the zeros kind of blend in and look like capital O's, right? So that's something you have to look at. And most systems are able to protect against this, but the best thing to do is that for your own domain, purchase the lookalike domains, buy them, right? Get them. In fact, even get what they call the cousin domains, right? So what cousin domains are is like the .net, the .com, the .org versions of your domain, right? Because they could potentially use those as well. But the hardest one of these spoofing is, and it's something that attackers have done and are known to do, is to do domain spoofing or direct domain spoofing. And then what they're doing is they're actually using the legitimate domain of that organization, right? They're using whatever at company.com, right? And this has been done. It has been done. If you read the news in 2020, right, about the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization, I hate to pick on them, but this happened to them. Their email address is at who.int. And that domain was actually being used in fraudulent emails. So phishing emails. People were looking to get donations, people telling them false information, people telling them to click on these links or download these links and then ended up being some sort of malware. And the only thing that who.int could do, so the World Health Organization can do to protect their domain, who.int, was to implement DMARC, right? That was the only way around it. They had to implement DMARC. They had some help and some guidance to do so. And then within, I believe, about 2 or 3 months, they had DMARC at the highest level of enforcement, and they were able to block all those fraudulent activities. Right, so this is the only way that you can do it. But this is something, again, that also happens to other, WHO or World Health Organization is a very large organization, yes. But I've seen things like this happen to small retail shops, right? There's a ski rental place here in the United States that was impacted. There's a small hospital that was impacted by things like this. So they had to implement DMARC in order to get back online and be able to send emails and be considered a legitimate domain again in order to send email. So what DMARC is, DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. So what it does, it is acting like a identity check for your domain, right? By creating a DMARC policy, now at this point, you are actually saying that my messages are protected. You need to check my policy and act accordingly. And when that policy that you're going to create, you're going to find the authentication, you're going to find the reporting, and you're going to find the conformance values, right? So that's the key main things that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. All right, but specifically with DMARC, so you're creating a DMARC policy. So as a sending organization, you create a policy, and in that policy, you're going to define that this is all my messages are being protected. This is what I'm using to protect my messages, right? And I'll tell you that we'll talk about the different authentication mechanisms that are used and what each of those do. But then what the receiving side is going to say, okay, looks like you have a DMARC policy for your domain. So messages coming from your domain, we need to check those and see, make sure that they're authorized, coming from an authorized location, make sure that they're passing the authentication checks, and then act accordingly, right? Then you act according to how you need to, the receiving side will act accordingly based on the sending organization's policy, right? So the question here is, how does DMARC protect your organization? It sounds like it protects everyone else from your domain from being spoofed, but that's how it's protecting your organization, right? So it's how it's protecting your brand. But there's the other half of DMARC as well, which is a verification side, which I'll talk about later. That's going to protect your domain from other people, right? So it's going to protect you against other people. So I'll mention that in a little bit. But overall, how this is protecting your organization is because DMARC is preventing unauthorized and fraudulent use of your organization's domain name in email fraud activity, right? Like who.int. This is, yes, it's protecting other organizations, but it's protecting your brand, right? Because the last thing you need is, during a situation that people lose confidence in your organization, right? Imagine how many people lost confidence in the World Health Organization once they read this news, or if they were part of that activity, right? They were the victims of that fraudulent activities, right? People aren't going to trust the World Health Organization at that point, and it couldn't happen at the worst possible situation, right? That's what you don't want to happen to your organization. You want to protect the brand and the integrity of your brand, of your organization, because when you do that, your business partners, your customers, your clients, your staff will now have increased confidence and trust in the emails that you're sending and that they're actually coming from your organization. Right, and some additional benefits to DMARC is that there's already inbox protection available on the consumer side. So consumer side, meaning the Gmail users, your Hotmail users, Yahoo.com, and so on. They have what they call DMARC verification in place, and that's checking incoming messages for a DMARC policy. Right, they're not applying a policy on it, they're doing DMARC verification. Those are two separate things, and I'll clarify that in the next slide. But they already have that. They don't know that, and you probably didn't know that until now, right? That those are already protected. They're already checking for those things. So if globalcyberalliance.org is sending an email to a Gmail user or a Hotmail user, they're checking against our DMARC policy to make sure it's coming from an authenticated, it's coming from an authorized source, is that it's being authenticated, and then following our policy if it's coming from a fraudulent location. So well over 80% of the current total number of worldwide email accounts are protected by this. So the number is much higher than 80. The other aspect is deliverability. Right, by implementing DMARC, you can improve deliverability, and it's been tested by some organizations. Like Gary, for example, did a case study with 4 different organizations, and they saw a 10 to 15% increase in deliverability. So deliverability meaning that message is actually going to the recipient's inbox as opposed to a spam folder. So that's very important to take into account. And then I also mentioned, right, like Google and Yahoo and those folks and Microsoft, they're actually checking your domains to see the level of spam and level of phishing activity that's being, fraudulent activity that's being seen. If they see a large amount, they can potentially start blocking you, right? And this is what I mentioned. This is something that actually happened to that small retail shop, and that's what happened to that small hospital. There's a large amount of spam activity that was determined by like Google and Microsoft that they said, we're going to block your domain until you fix this. And the only way for them to fix it was to implement DMARC, right? Because they had to implement DMARC correctly and accurately. And then once they did so within a 24-hour period, and probably actually less, I think it was for the hospital, I think it ended up being less, they were able to send mail again. Right, so that's something that you have to take into account, right? Because you want your messages to go to the inbox. You don't want your messages ending up in spam. You don't want your messages ending up elsewhere. And the other nice thing about DMARC is the reporting capability, the visibility that it gives you, because you actually get all these reports, and those reports can tell you about the type of activity that's going on. And that activity is going to show you not only the legitimate ones, so the servers that actually are allowed to send, but also the servers that are not allowed to send. So you actually see both in these reports that are being generated. So you can actually end up creating a good IT asset inventory. You can actually see, okay, wait a minute, we're using HubSpot, or we're using MailChimp. Who's using it? Who set it up? And you can ask the organization, who set this up? Why didn't you come through IT or tell the email staff that this is something that you had set up? But then again, at the same time, you also see all that fraudulent activity as well. So there's 2 parts to DMARC, right? Because when it comes to email, there's 2 sides to email. There's a receiving side and there's a sending side. So what you have to do is you have to put in both of these aspects of DMARC. You have to put in a DMARC policy. So DMARC policy is something that you're going to create in your existing DNS. So as long as you own the domain, that means you have a DNS infrastructure for it, whether it be the Windows, whether it be Bind, or whether it be a cloud service provider, a cloud DNS provider, right? You have DNS for that domain because you're the owner of the domain. So you, as the owner of that domain, are responsible for creating that DMARC policy. But that's what the sending organization needs to do, right? You create that DMARC policy in your DNS. And again, just give you a brief overview of what the policy looks like. But then as a receiving organization, you have to turn on or enable DMARC verification, right? So you're not creating something. So your DMARC verification is not your policy. DMARC verification is a tool that you're using to check all incoming messages to see if a DMARC policy exists for that domain that you're receiving mail from. Right, so you need to have both in place because you as an organization are a sender and you're a receiver, right? So make sure you have those in place. If you're using Office 365, you're using Google Workspace, those are there by default. The DMARC verification is enabled by default. I haven't seen an option to be able to disable it, but it is there by default. It's the DMARC policy that you have to create, right? So DMARC policy you create, you protect your brand, you protect your domain. DMARC verification, you turn that on to protect your organization from fraudulent activity potentially coming from legitimate sources or legitimate domains that are there. So there's a question, can an organization opt for either DMARC policy or DMARC verification, or both are required? You need to do both. You need to do both. You can't opt for one because you can do DMARC verification, but then DMARC verification is not going to prevent your domain from being used. Only the policy is going to do that. The policy is going to prevent your domain from being used for fraudulent activity. DMARC verification is going to be used to check other organizations' domains. Okay, so that's why you need to have both enabled, both set up and for your environment. So if we're using Office 365, is DMARC set up by default then only for verification? So Office 365 is only for verification. That's it. For Office 365, you still must create a DMARC policy. Same with Google Workspace. Google Workspace, DMARC verification is enabled by default. You as an organization must still create the DMARC policy, right? There's nothing out there that will create the DMARC policy for you. You actually have to create that and do it. For DMARC verification, you go into your email security gateway. So if you have like a Cisco Iron Port or a Mimecast server, you can turn on DMARC verification for incoming messages, right? That's something that you need to do and you need to check for, right? So you need to make sure those two parts are in place. So as an organization, do both. Do not do one or the other. Don't forget it, don't just do the policy and not protect yourself with the verification. Make sure you do both. So when DMARC verification is turned on, does your email drop mail that does not have DMARC policies, or do you control what happens with those email messages? I'll explain that in a little bit. So as we go along, I'm going to talk about different myths when it comes to DMARC, because there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to DMARC. So we'll talk about those, and there's a lot of these misconceptions are concerns about DMARC. So first one is it's used on email domains only. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about phishing, right? We're talking about spoofing. We're mainly focusing on email, but it's not only for email actually, because any domain, right? Any public domain, even if you do not have it registered for email, or have an email account, set up for it, it can still be used for spoofing and for phishing. So an attacker can still take that domain. So because like some organizations, like a small business, they'll have a website, they'll create their domain and register a website, but for email, they'll use Gmail or Hotmail, right? And that's fine. But your domain that you have for a website, that can be used for email. There's nothing stopping people from using that unless you implement DMARC. So what you actually want to take a look at when you're implementing a DMARC policy is apply a DMARC policy to any public-facing domain that you own, right? So again, public-facing, not a private one, not something that you keep internal to your organization, something that's public-facing, something that's that people on the outside can see. So that's something that you need to do. So apply a DMARC policy on all public domains, regardless of whether you're using it for email or not. Now we're going to break it apart a little bit here. Authentication. So DMARC, one part is authentication, right? So in order to do authentication with DMARC, it actually uses other security mechanisms to do that. So it uses two things called sender policy framework and domain keys identified mail. Okay, do you need to have both? No, you don't need to have both, but you at least have to have one of the two. If you're going to have one of the two, the one you want to have is DKIM. That's the one you want to have in place. So what are these two things? So SPF, Sender Policy Framework, that's what you're going to use to define which systems are authorized to send mail using your domain name, right? And the idea here is that if it's not on this list, it's to be considered fraudulent activity, right? And then you're probably thinking, well, why can't I just use SPF? Why do I have to have DMARC? Well, if you're using a cloud service provider especially, what's to prevent other people using that same cloud service from using your domain name, right? Because they're all using the same servers. You're not necessarily going to have a unique mail server assigned just to you. You're most likely to have multiple email, all sharing the same email server or email server cluster. So what's to prevent them? And I'll talk about more detail about this next week and go into more detail and deep dive into it a little bit. And we'll actually talk about different parts of an SPF policy as well. And then DKIM is going to add a digital signature. So if you've heard of PGP, pretty good privacy, PGP, which is a digital signature, or actually it could also be encryption as well, but focusing on the digital signature side. So every message that you send out, it signs it with a digital signature to prove that it's actually coming from you, right? So as long as the other side has the key, they can actually say, okay, this is coming from that person. So DKIM is almost similar to that aspect, but it's at the server level. So on your servers, your email servers, you're going to have tools installed, or you have its DKIM signing capability. So that way, every message that comes out of that server for that domain is digitally signed. So that adds another layer of authentication. But that's all it does, right? It doesn't say what to do with fraudulent messages or things that are not signed or things that don't match the digital signatures. So if the private key, public keys don't match up, it doesn't say what to do with it, right? Which is one of the pitfalls of using it. But this is why DMARC comes into play, because DMARC is going to actually say, hey, you should check SP to see our SPF, you should check to see our DKIM just to make sure everything is set up correctly, right? So at minimum, make sure DKIM is at least set up. SPF tends to have more issues when it comes to third parties or external third-party email providers. Now, conformance aspects. So in the terms of conformance, when you create your policy, you're defining what to do with those fraudulent messages, how to act with those fraudulent messages that are coming in, right? But you have 3 different policy settings that you can apply for DMARC to protect your organization. So one is none. So it's policy level none. This is what I like to call monitored only mode. And what monitored only mode means is that, hey, look, I'm putting in a DMARC policy, but I don't want you to enforce my policy yet. What I want to do is I want to see what's in these reports, right? Because the policy is going to define where reports are going to go to. You're going to find in that report, you're going to find that you're going to, get that information, review those reports, determine, okay, are all my legitimate servers set up correctly? Are all my legitimate servers set up correctly with SPF? Are they set up correctly with DKIM? Everything is set up correctly, so that means everything else that's left should be the fraudulent activity. Okay, let's move up to a higher level. So this is where now you can move up to quarantine or reject. Really, ultimately, you want to try your best to get to reject. Because at quarantine, if any of these checks fail, so SPF, DKIM, and alignment failed, then the message is going to get sent to spam or junk folder. If SPF, DKIM, and alignment fail, then the message is completely dropped and not delivered at all if you're at reject. Right? So these are the settings that you're defining in your policy, so that way the receiving side who has DMARC verification enabled will know how to act. So these three settings someone's asking about for outgoing or incoming messages. These are the three settings for incoming messages for the receiving organization, right? Because receiving organization is going to follow the sender's DMARC policy and act accordingly using DMARC verification, right? So I hope that made sense there. So best practice, start at none and gradually make your way up to reject. Don't start off at reject right away. Because we've seen a lot of people have issues with that. They start at reject and they don't really know their environment that well, right? We've seen this happen with a financial organization. They told the story to us about this, that they implemented it. They implemented DMARC and they went right to reject because they felt they knew their environment. They had good IT inventory in place, so they knew all their email servers. But lo and behold, a month or two later, they got a call from the executive administrative assistant of the CEO, and they said our newsletter is not being received by a good amount of people. The CEO is not happy about this. What do we do? What happened? Why is this happening? It's because the IT department and the email department did not know that they were doing that and using a third-party vendor to send those mails, right? So so they had to revert back to none, make the changes, send out test email to make sure everything works, review the reports, everything looked fine, then they went back up to reject. Right? So these three settings that you're going to be implementing are on the sending side, because remember, DMARC policy is for the sending organization. So as a sending organization in your policy, in your DNS setting, you're going to say, this is our policy, and receiving side, please follow this policy. So yeah, so another question here. So you are telling other organizations how to handle your outgoing messages based on how well you implement DMARC. Yes, that's correct. You are telling, by you creating a DMARC policy, you are telling other organizations that have DMARC verification enabled how to handle your outgoing messages. So does both SPF and DKIM need to fail for quarantine? Yes. So both SPF and DKIM, and there's another part called alignment. So there's actually three parts that have to fail in order for it. So SPF and DKIM both need to fail in order for it to quarantine. Both need to fail in order for it to be rejected. So that's why I say, so as long as you have DKIM set up correctly, then you know the good chance you're going to be fine. So and we'll talk about this later in I believe week 4. So if SPF passes and DKIM fails, you're still good. If DKIM fails, so DKIM passes and SPF fails, you're still good. But if all of this fails, then your messages are going to either quarantine or reject. So how does this all work? So I'm hoping that this will actually help clarify a few things as well. So again, remember, we're going to be talking about things in more detail as we go along. We can only talk about so much in this limited time that we have. So first step is that you, again, so a sending organization. So I'll say sending organizations right now, it's globalcyberalliance.org. So it's globalcyberalliance.org. I published a DMARC record on my DNS, right? So I put this on our DNS and created that policy, and I set our policy to say, let's say for now, policy is set to none. So what happens at the user side, they just type out their messages like they normally do. They don't need anything special installed. They don't need anything done in there because everything's happening on the server side. So they don't even need to know that this is going on, right? Unless you decide to tell them, but they don't need to know any of this is happening. They just type up their message, hit send, and then at the sending organization's email server, right, just as it typically actually add all this metadata to that email, right? That's how you get all your header information at the receiving side, right? It's going to say where it's coming from. This is the IP address it's coming from, or the servers that's coming from. This is where the DKIM signing is going to happen, right? This is, or it could be at the email server, or it could be at your email security gateway if you have a gateway, or it could be at the gateway as well. So that's where you need to, that's where all this, everything is happening. And then you're sending out the email server to the recipient's email, to the recipient, right? So the recipient's email server or email gateway receives the message. Now, if they do not have DMARC verification enabled, so it's not turned on, and there's a DMARC policy on that for that message, it's not going to get checked. It's just going to go through all the other filters, spam filters or phishing filters or any other filters that are in place, and then pass on the message accordingly based on those filters, not on DMARC. Right now, if you have DMARC verification enabled, right? So we're Global Cyber Alliance. I sent the email to, I don't know, IBM.com. IBM.com has DMARC verification enabled. They look at my domain, say, okay, the domain is globalcyberalliance.org. Let's go and check to see if globalcyberalliance.org has a DMARC policy. And when they find that we have a policy, they're going to act accordingly. Now they're going to say, okay, let's check SPF, let's check for DCAM, let's check for alignment, let's check to see if all this stuff is passing or if all this stuff is failing. Now, based on my policy, so since my policy currently is set to none, what it's going to do is going to say, okay, well, you know what? It's actually coming from a fraudulent source, and authentication and authorization are failing. But since your policy is set to none, we're going to let the message go through. Right, and assuming the other checks don't fail. Right, but if my policy was set to quarantine, right, if my policy was set to quarantine, what happens here? Those fraudulent messages get sent to the recipient spam junk folder. Right, all legitimate messages get through. Anything that's fraudulent goes into the spam or junk folder set to quarantine. If my policy is set to reject, right, any fraudulent messages are going to get dropped and not delivered at all. And all legitimate messages should just go straight to the inbox. Right, so you see how the receiving side, they have DMARC verification enabled, but they're checking the sending organization's DMARC policy to see what to do and how to act and what kinds of things they need to check. Right, so it's the receiving side that's acting on your policy as long as they have DMARC verification turned on and DMARC verification enabled. Okay. And then these reports, we're going to talk about reports in the next few slides. So these reports are actually now coming back from the receiving side, right? Because there's the recipients servers that know how they're handling the messages, right? So the receiving side is going to tell you whether SPF passed or failed, whether DCAM passed or failed, whether DMARC passed or failed. They're going to tell you the IP address of the server that these messages are coming from, right? And it'll tell you the legitimate servers, and it'll also tell you the fraudulent servers, right? Because they're the ones who are seeing all the activity, right? They're the ones who are getting these messages, so they are able to tell you about these messages. So they're the ones who are going to send the reports back to you to let you know what's going on and how to, what's going on, and then what changes or adjustments that you need to make, and what kind of fraudulent activity is potentially happening. Right, so those are the kinds of things. So that's why those reports are going to be important, and make sure that you want to receive those reports and you want to review those reports. So I know there's a lot of questions in here. A lot of them came in at once, so I'm going to probably wait at this point so that way I'm not holding things up, and get to them towards the end. So DMARC, you're creating in DNS, and you're creating this as a TXT record. So that's a specific type of record that is in DNS. It has to be a TXT record that you're creating, and you're setting this up, unless somehow using some third-party vendor. By default, DMARC is designed to be set up as a TXT record. And the way it works is that the host name, the name of the record, so every DNS record has some sort of name. So either it's left blank or null, or it's going to be assigned a name. And in this case for DMARC, it's always underscore DMARC and in lowercase. So always underscore DMARC dot and then your domain name. But again, depending on the type of system you have, you may not have to supply the domain name. It may automatically append it for you. And then you supply a value. And I'm not going to go into detail with these values right now. This is what we're going to do in week 3. In week 3, I'm going to go through the value and break apart each one of these. So what does V equals? What does P equals? What does RUA mean? What does RUF mean? What does FO and ADCAM and so on? What do each one of these mean? Right? But for very quick purposes, you can see where you can define your policy when you create this for your organization. P equals none, right? That's defining your policy. This is where you put in P equals none, or you change it to P equals quarantine, or you change it to P equals reject. So you only have one DMARC policy per domain. Okay, one DMARC policy per domain. So I saw a question about subdomains. Can you apply DMARC policy to subdomains? Yes, you can, but only do that if that subdomain is being used for email. And the reason why is because when you create a DMARC policy for your top level domain, it automatically applies to all of your subdomains. So you don't have to create a DMARC policy for each individual subdomain if they're not being used for email purposes. They are being used for email purposes, then yes, you want to consider creating a DMARC policy, setting up SPF and setting up DKIM specifically for that subdomain. Otherwise, you don't need to. Now these reports. So there's two types of reports that are getting generated by DMARC, right? There's aggregate reports and forensic reports. And in week 4, I'm going to go into much more detail on both of these. Right, so aggregate reports are something that you want to get because that's the one that's going to give you the most information. That'll have the IPs, the SPF information, DKIM, DMARC, and so on. The forensic reports are going to be actual messages. And the goal of the forensic reports are that you're not going to actually show you what's going on and why this potentially these messages fail. But you want to get these reports so that way you can get all the information you can get. You can determine which ones are considered suspicious and how quickly you need to move up to a DMARC policy of enforcement, and also to get your IT asset inventory. But again, in week 4, I'm going to go into much more detail on each one of these. So this is what a sample of an aggregate report looks like. It is an XML document. Not the best way to do this is, to open up the attachment and read it. There are tools that you can use. And again, I'm going to talk about that in week 4. This is an example of forensic and failure reports. So this is like, if you look at it, if you're familiar with how to read message headers, that's what you're seeing here is the message headers, because you're actually getting the message and it appears as though you were part of the recipient of the message, but that's what you're getting here. Now I want to talk about some concerns with implementation. So these are some additional myths that are involved that people have talked about and said that, yeah, but this impacts email. This is something that, we could break things inside. So I want to talk about each one of these. So one myth is that it's a silver bullet. So DMARC is not going to be the cure for phishing, right? DMARC is just one layer that you need to implement in your defense for email security, right? Because once you implement DMARC and you create a DMARC policy, you have DMARC verification in place, you still need to have your anti-spam, anti-phishing tools in place. You still need to have that email security gateway. You still need to use other mechanisms like DANE or MTA-STS to help, secure communications between two servers. So these are things that we're going to talk about towards the end, like some additional email authentication mechanisms that you can use. So don't just stop at DMARC and turn off your anti-spam filters. Still keep those all turned on. You still need those. It's not good for privacy. Because people are afraid of reading those forensic reports, and the forensic reports, because that can actually, like I said, it can be the full-blown message. It can actually contain the attachments. It tells you who the recipient is and who the sender is. So there might be some issues in that, but those forensic reports will only go to whomever you allow to view those reports. Otherwise, those reports are not being sent. Otherwise, those other reports, it's just IP information. It's not giving you any other detail or other information, but you just have to be careful where you send those reports to. DMARC is easy to do. And as you guys see, we're going to get very technical over the next few weeks. So getting started with DMARC and creating, as long as you know how to create a DNS record, getting started is actually relatively simple, right? Because you can actually go back those few slides of that one DNS record I showed you, the top one that's for basic. If you did that right now, you've implemented DMARC, and that only takes you maybe like 5 minutes, or unless you have change control, it could take you 2 weeks because of change control. But that only takes a few minutes to implement, a few minutes to put into place. But the hard part about DMARC is actually the reports, analyzing the reports, reviewing the reports, and knowing what actions to take next to adjust your policies and make changes to your policies, right? And we'll cover it to some extent on week 4. It's going to negatively impact my mail. That's not true. I mean, if you do not set this up correctly, yeah, right? Because like, or if you jump to DMARC to reject, or if you don't set up your SPF correctly, or DKIM's not working correctly, you didn't authenticate or authorize things and enable things where you're supposed to, then yeah, it could negatively impact your mail. But that's only if you didn't configure it correctly, or if you didn't set it up correctly. But if you set it up correctly and the way it's supposed to work and it's intended, it actually improves your email, right? Like I mentioned before, it improves the delivery rate of your email, and less likely of you getting on like these blacklists or spam lists and things like that. It's only for large entities. No, that's not true, right? Any organization, doesn't matter what size you are. If you're a startup, do DMARC, right? Because they can start using you. They say, oh, here's a new startup, let's take advantage of it. Let's see what they do. Or if it's Fortune 500 company, they'll go after them too. It doesn't matter what size organization you are. Any and every type of organization that owns a domain or uses some level of domain needs to implement DMARC. And anti-spam filters are enough. They're not, because anti-spam filters are not going to protect your brand. They're not going to prevent emails coming from your brand, because they're going to look at it and say, oh, this is a legitimate organization. This is their actual email address. So we're good. Let it go through. Right? But that's where DMARC has to come in play. So you're adding DMARC as an additional layer to these anti-spam filters that you have in place and anti-phishing filters. Not enough resources. That could potentially be true, right? So not enough resources really going to be, more for larger organizations, maybe medium-sized organizations, and that's because they have multiple subdomains that they use for email purposes. So it's going to take time for them to go through all those different subdomains and go through and adjust those subdomains and make sure they're set up correctly for email and sending email and making sure their policies are set up correctly. So what I've seen is that resources end up being needed more for analysis actually than actual implementation. So mailing list and mail forwarders. So I think there was a question somewhere here about mailing lists and mail forwarders. They actually break authentication. So it's not only DMARC, but they actually break SPF and DKIM, right? Because if SPF and DKIM break, then DMARC is going to break too. So what you could do is you could use just implement DKIM. Make sure DKIM is set there, because most mail forwarders and mailing lists preserve DKIM. They preserve the passing on of DKIM. Or you can do something like authenticated receive chain, but that's only if you're responsible for mailing lists and mail forwarders. Then use something like authenticated receive chain. Otherwise, it's not necessary. So not everyone needs to do ARC. Okay, so I know like some universities tend to use mailing lists. So you may want to take a look at ARC and see if that's something that you can that's something you can use and that's something that will work for you. So those are some concerns implementation, but again, the benefits far outweigh those. And I told you, a lot of those concerns, as long as things are done correctly and things are implemented correctly, it shouldn't be an issue. So items that you need to plan for. So understanding SPF and DKIM and DMARC, right? This is what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. So week 2, we'll go into a deep dive of SPF and DKIM. Not going to go too far, but we're going to at least give you a high level overview of both. We'll talk about some of the items in those records when you're creating them and how to create them. And then week 3, we'll break apart the DMARC policy and then give you a demonstration of how to implement SPF, DKIM, and DMARC in those various DNS. You need to have access to DNS, right? Whether you're the admin for DNS or you have somebody else that you go through, know your policy if there's a change control, right? We talked about the 3 levels: none, quarantine, and reject. So those 3, it's important to know and understand what each one of those means. Know allowed about DKIM. Again, we'll talk about this next week, how to look for whether your server supports it or not. Have a list of your public domains. If you have your subdomains that are used, have those as well, especially if they're used for email. So you can see if you need to create a DMARC policy for them or not. Some things that you may not know about are the third-party vendors. And then once you find out about the third-party vendors, do they support DKIM and or SPF? Or other mail systems that your staff might not be aware of. But this is where the reports can help you, right? The reports can give you that information, provide that type of information. And then DMARC report analysis, be prepared for that. Find a generic email address to send those reports to. So some additional resources that are available to you. So DMARC.org. So these are all going to be available on the DMARC.globalcyberalliance.org website. If you go to the bootcamp section, there's a lot of resources that are available to you. I am going to go through the questions. I know we hit the top of the hour at 9 a.m. If you have time to stay on, I'll stay on for another few minutes to go through all the questions that are listed here, or I may push off the question to the later week. But all of your resources are available here. If you do have any questions at any point in time, so if you want to ask questions afterwards as well, you can go to community.globalcyberalliance.org, and that's a forum that's available for free. And that's where I'm on there. We have other subject matter experts that are on there that can help you with your DMARC journey as well. So as a reminder, the next session is May 12th. The next session, we're going to talk about SPF and DKIM. So first half will be SPF, latter half will be DKIM, and we'll talk about it and give you high-level overviews of both, benefits and downfalls to both of those, and some of the tags that are associated with each one. All right, so let me go through some of these questions and see what I may have missed. So unless the recipient side is set up to act, DMARC is just a recommendation. So no, DMARC is not just a recommendation. DMARC is something you want to do. You're not going to know if the recipient side has DMARC verification enabled or not. So it's better just to be safe and implement a DMARC policy on your side regardless of that. Especially because remember, the consumer side, if you're sending a lot of email to Gmail users and Hotmail users and so on, you still want your messages to get to those people. And they already have DMARC verification enabled. So make sure you still have your DMARC policy. So as a no matter what, I mean, DMARC policy is a must. So if you're using something like webmail, so like if you're using like Office 365 G Suite, you still have DNS. So in your DNS, you're still going to create that policy there. So that's something that you need to do. But if you're using like Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo.com as your emails, you can't do anything there. That Yahoo and Google are the ones who have to be responsible for creating a policy and setting up everything there. How wise to open email or check on spam folder email? It's a great question. At your own risk, that's the best I can say. Because I do check my spam messages folder. And I do look at the preview of it, but I don't click on anything unless I know exactly what's going on or if that was an expected message. But at least I think 99% of the messages I get in spam are actually fraudulent, or they're people just marketing stuff that I don't really care about. So address list servers I just mentioned, you know, and then third parties that do not conform to DMARC. That's tough too. I mean, there's a group that's out there that are trying to get people to, you know, conform to DMARC. You know, tell them get an SPF set up at minimum, at least get DKIM set up, so that way they can, you know, people can keep using them and utilize them. A good majority of people are actually going through and doing so. So if not, then your option is you can say, well, we're going to switch over to a different service that does support it. Are there any cyber attack techniques reported which targets DMARC specifically? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I know that there have been cases of bad actors using DMARC because they implement their own DMARC policy, but the problem is when they did so, they are now open to being found, right? Because in order to create a DMARC policy and set this up, they actually have to make their presence aware, right? They have to set up in DNS, they have to set up everything, and now people can actually go after them. Do receiving email servers honor SPF record if you don't have DKIM DMARC set up? Depends. Some people are, I mean, SPF has been around for a long time, and some people do SPF checking. The problem is going to be, and we're going to talk about this next week, is that if your SPF is set up correctly, remember the receiving side makes the decision on how to act on your message then. So if your SPF is not set up correctly and the receiving side says, you know what, we're going to reject any messages that, you know, we're strictly follow their SPF, you could potentially be blocking a legitimate message. So yeah, some do. Some still honor your SPF record. So we mentioned no need for DMARC for internal domains, only apply to public-facing domains. Can DMARC not help with attacks, frauds, and originating internally? So yeah, you want to only do it for public-facing domains. And when you do it for the public-facing domains, that could help your even messages coming to you using your own domain being sent to your domain. right? But the problem is if you set it up internally between your systems, it actually breaks things and it actually causes a lot of problems. That's why you only want to focus on doing it on outgoing messages and incoming messages rather than worrying about internal to your environment. What if third-party senders, email campaign companies are sending on behalf of your domain? Is that only handled by SPF? So third-party vendors will do SPF and DKIM. So you need to work with them to find out what to implement in your SPF, what to implement for DKIM, and once you do that, your DMARC policy is going to go into effect. So your DMARC policy will actually still apply to those as well. So if you do not have SPF or DKIM set up with those third-party vendors or third-party senders, and your policy is set to reject, you're not going to be able to send mail using those third-party senders until you have SPF and DKIM set up for that vendor. Our receiving organization will have to implement DMARC as well as ensure free flow of correspondent. Yes. So again, remember, you as an organization are both a receiver and a sender. So you do need to implement a DMARC policy and you need to enable DMARC verification. You need to do both. That is required. It needs to be done in order to fully protect yourself. So I received CNAME records from third-party vendors to put in DNS that somehow satisfy the SPF and DKIM requirements. Not sure it works though. You can contact me directly and we can try it out, or you can use some SPF checkers and DKIM checkers out there to just confirm. But yeah, CNAME records are fine when it comes to SPF and DKIM records. As long as the vendor provided to you, you can try it out and test it out. And you can actually look at the DMARC reports. It'll tell you whether they passed or failed. If using Office 365 and a security email gateway, is DMARC policy needed in Office 365? Yes, a DMARC policy is going to be required no matter what you're using. Because that's something you have to create in DMARC verification. What you will do is on security email gateway is enable DMARC verification. So turn it on there, even though Office 365 will have it on by default, but turn it on the email security gateway as well, just as a secondary precaution. How to confirm if recipient's email server had DMARC verification enabled? That's very hard to do. One way is if they send you a report back, then you know DMARC verification is enabled, right? But otherwise, yeah, it's very difficult to determine if the other side or the receiving side has DMARC verification enabled. Will you look at things like hosted SPF and hosted DKIM as options on this course? I'll let you be aware of some options that are available and that are available to you, but we're not going to really go deep dive into that because those are just vendor specific and we're trying to avoid the cost side if we can. Is there anything that can be done if we receive bounce backs NDRs from what we believe are phishing campaigns? Yeah, and again, this is where DMARC should help with that a little bit as well, because they may be blocking you because they feel that you're part of spamming or phishing, or you may not be on a block list. So the best thing is to do is just actually implement DMARC. Is there any alternatives to DMARC? Nope, not that I'm aware of. There's nothing that I'm aware of that's out there that'll actually protect your brand to the level that DMARC does. I mean, technically you could use SPF and DKIM by itself, but SPF doesn't rely on DKIM and DKIM doesn't rely on SPF. So DMARC is just going to be something that's going to help you, utilize the benefits of both of them. Circumvent the SPF limitations. We'll talk about that next week. So I'm going to actually hold that off till next week. With the DKIM record, so when using a DKIM record for one mail server and not the others, does this go? Yes, it can go wrong. Make sure all your email servers have, so if if you're in an Exchange environment, Exchange doesn't do DKIM by default, so you're gonna have to install a DKIM tool, a DKIM signing tool on each server. Can we set DKIM verification monitor mode just to see the potential blocking of it? No, you can't. Well, technically, yes, you could. You can enable it depending on some email security gateways will allow you to override DMARC policies. It's not recommended to override somebody else's DMARC policy. So if you implement DMARC verification, just follow the policy of the other organization. Otherwise, you're going to create more work for yourself, because you're not responsible for the other organization. And if they set up their DMARC policy incorrectly or their SPF correctly, it's SPF incorrectly, it's on them. It's not on you, unless you have a really close relationship with them. We have had offices set up email sending hosts to enable copiers to send email. Is there a way to discover which emails use these valid sending as opposed to invalid senders? That's a good question. So if you could probably see these in your DMARC reports. It depends on how that email, like those copiers are sending that information. If it's sending it just using your internal organization's email server, then you're not going to be able to tell the difference. If it uses their own thing that's somehow built into it, then you need to look at the DMARC reports. They should be able to tell you this information and be able to share that information with you in there. Will we cover BIMI as an extension of DMARC? Yes, but we won't. Unfortunately, we will not cover it until week 5. But if you're looking for BIMI resources, if you go to DMARC.Global Cyber Alliance, or if you go to www.Global Cyber Alliance, we do have a section for BIMI under trustworthy email, our trustworthy email project, and there's BIMI information there if you don't want to wait till week 5, or send me an email and I can provide you with a little bit of the information as well. All right, it looks like I got all the questions. I thank you everyone for staying on 11 minutes later, those of you who stayed on. There's a lot of things that we're going to cover. There's a lot of great questions that people are asking. We're going to do our best to kind of cover it. I mean, we've had cases where we go over because of all the questions, so I will go over it at points and times. So if you can stay, please stay. Otherwise, send me a separate email, or post the message, the question on the community forum, and we'll help you out as best as we can. So thank you, everybody. Looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Hopefully, everyone interest is staying high, and we'll talk about SPF and DKIM. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, or evening.